Hello, I'm Doug, and welcome to the Krewe of Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
This time on Krewe of Japan podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. If you are just generally interested in Japan and have been paying attention to the news over the last, 6 to 8 months, you'll have heard about a few different political shifts that have been happening. For example, like the emergence of a party called Sanseito, making unexpected gains in the national legislature, or maybe the historic election of Sanae Takaichi as Japan's first female prime minister back last month. So today, we are treating you to a crash course in Japanese politics. How the systems work, who the players are, what has driven change, and what is driving change today. But we're not experts in this stuff, so to walk us through it, we are joined by political analyst Tobias Harris of Japan Foresight. Tobias has a sharp eye on Japan's government structure, the evolving party scene, and the domestic and global forces that are shaping Japan's future. Throughout this episode with Tobias as our guide, we are going to explore the basic architecture of Japan's government, from power distribution to comparisons to what we're familiar with here over in the US.
So the system, it worked one way, from the 50s basically into the 90s. Since the 90s, it has changed a bit. Much stronger executive, much stronger prime ministerial leadership than before.
Dig into the political landscape as a whole, ranging from the various political parties in Japan to the voters who vote for them.
Of course, you have the LDP. The LDP now, as of several weeks ago, is now governing in partnership with a party that is really Osaka-based, that's been around since around 2009, 2010, called, in Japanese, it's Isshin no Kai.
Touch on topical issues like demographic changes, media influences, and global pressures.
Under 40, young Japanese are not reading newspapers. They're not watching normal sort of broadcast television. It's social media, it's YouTube. It is very much not the traditional news sources. And so there is that sort of information polarization feeding political polarization.
And so much more. Whether you're a political scientist curious to learn more about East Asian power players, or maybe just someone who's like, what's an LDP? This episode should shine a light on a lot of things that go on domestically within Japanese politics. So strap in, it's time to kick off our conversation with Tobias Harris. Let's go. Thinking about finally learning Japanese, but worried you'll end up just mumbling arigato or konnichiwa forever? Don't worry, NewOrleansJapaneseLessons.com has you covered. Classes are led by Romi Sensei, a native Japanese speaker with over 20 years of teaching experience. She's been teaching online since before it was trendy. 2014, baby! Plus, her classes are super small, 6 people max, so you'll actually get to speak and get real feedback, not just sit there quietly wondering if you're butchering the word ramen. Romi Sensei's lived in New Orleans for over 15 years, and personal friends of mine have taken her classes. They seriously rave about how fun, clear, and downright awesome she is. Why keep telling yourself, I'll start learning next week in English, when you could just say it in Japanese and actually follow through with it at the same time? Check out NewOrleansJapaneseLessons.com, that's lessons with an S, and get started today. Are you new to the crew? Yokoso! We hope you enjoy this episode. If you like what you hear today, then you'll really love our back catalog of episodes from earlier this season and previous seasons. We've had some incredible guests, like architect Asby Brown, observing changes in urban and rural Japanese communities. Castle expert William DeLong mapping out Japanese castles. Longtime Fukushima resident William McMichael discussing Fukushima's recovery through educational tourism. And so much more. After you finish up this episode, hit that subscribe button or follow or whatever it is, and get notified when new episodes come out. Then while you wait for the new episode to drop, play catch up with the crew. But before you do any of that, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the first interview we've recorded since probably May, January. I don't know when it was, but it's been a while.
No idea.
I've changed
it's
offices.
So long, I forgot.
Yeah, I've changed offices, houses. There may be a noticeable echo, maybe. Sorry if there is. I don't have the dampening sound stuff in there yet. So we'll get there. But we wanted to conduct this interview. It was kind of like a spur of the moment. We had a lot of changes in Japan recently and wanted to discuss this, especially on the political and the government scene. So who better to reach out to than Tobias Harris, not the NBA player, Tobias Harris, but Tobias Harris, the founder and principal of Japan Foresight. So Tobias, welcome to Krewe of Japan podcast.
Thank you for having me on. Really, it's it's been quite a momentous year for Japan's politics. I mean, really, and we're in a period now that things are going to be pretty fluid and uncertain for a while. So great time to talk about that.
It is.
Yeah. But before we jump into it, we always start off with an icebreaker about New Orleans, since we're Japan Society New Orleans podcast. I say this every time, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. But for you, have you ever been to New Orleans? And if you have, like, what's your favorite memory? Or if you haven't, what do you think of when you hear New Orleans?
Unfortunately, I have not. It is very high on the list of places I would like to get to. I have heard, for many, many years just how good the food is. I love everything I hear about it. I think about jazz, obviously, and, a whole lot of history, and actually just did a family trip to the Civil War battlefields of Tennessee in August. So, I'm sure, adding New Orleans onto the itinerary as far as that is concerned would be great. So no, hopefully it is high on the list. I'm just not sure when exactly I'd get there.
Yeah, they got the Chalmette Battlefield, and I know they have a few other sites that you can kind of check out that are historical, I guess, landmarks or monuments to some of those battles.
I think Chalmette even does like a play, like a
reenactment.
Acting,
they do.
Okay. Reenactment of things. So that's pretty cool if you could like figure out when that is and come during that.
Yeah. So now on to Japan. What is your Japan journey personally? Like, how did you get interested in Japan and more specifically Japanese politics?
Oddly enough, it actually started with Japanese literature between high school and college, just getting really interested in reading it in translation, and then sort of getting to college day one. I studied German all through high school and thought I was going to just keep doing that. And then I got to college and like, nope, got to learn Japanese. So I found the office of the one Japanese professor because the intro to Japanese class was booked, and like left a note saying like, I really, really want to take this if there's any way to get in. And then like a bunch of people dropped it. And so there was a place for me. And so, did 4 years of Japanese in college and studied abroad, and really I've always been kind of a politics junkie. So kind of always figured, okay, I'm learning the language. Like, I guess that means I'm going to have to look at US-Japan relations and Japan's politics in East Asia. And so ended up doing that, and then went to the UK, did a master's, did some field work while doing that in Japan, found a diet member to work for. And then it's just been, ever since, just kind of like, I'm in, like, this is what I'm doing now, and have spent a lot of years just thinking and writing and analyzing how Japan's politics work.
Nice. Where did you study abroad? Just curious.
I was at Sophia University in Tokyo.
Me too.
Okay.
There you go, Doug.
I mean, there aren't that many places where it seems where people wind up. So yeah, I was there in the spring of 2004.
Oh, I was 05, 06.
Okay.
Yeah, so fall, spring. So you just missed you. But so you were at the Ichigaya campus then?
Yes. I know they moved to Yotsuya not long after that, but yeah, I was
spring.
Yeah.
That spring
yeah.
semester.
So I was at Ichigaya. I was like the last of the Ichigaya group.
Yeah, it was a nice campus. It was kind of quaint, small, but Yotsuya, we felt much more like in a university campus when you're at Yotsuya, though.
Yeah, it took a lot more effort to like actually go over there and do things. I actually ended up practicing with it wasn't like the Yotsuya baseball team, but I think like at a club, the club level, which, required going over there. And, that was fun. I mean, no, it was great. It was, I have a lot of really great memories. It was a great way of sort of jumping into Japan.
Yeah.
With both feet, I did a homestay out in Chiba. So I was, I was commuting like everyone, it was great.
That's awesome. Yeah, I did it's funny you mentioned the baseball thing. I didn't do baseball, but I did like the American Football Club.
Okay.
And I joined that, and it was like 6 days a week practice and like a game on Sunday if they had a game.
Very serious.
Yeah.
I joined in the spring, and then I realized, you know what? I only got 2 more months left in Japan. This isn't for me.
Yeah.
So I had to bounce out, unfortunately. But it was a good experience to feel like what it is like to be in a club sport.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly such an important part of university life for a Japanese college student that you just like to get the flavor, at least, is really worthwhile.
For sure, yeah.
Well, to dive back into Japanese politics, when people think of Japan's government, it looks somewhat familiar with parallels to like legislative bodies and executive leaders, but it doesn't really operate like what we're used to here in the US. So to get things started, could you give us like a quick overview of how Japan's government is structured and how the distribution of power is like? As well as like some big differences between Japan's system and what we know here in the US?
So the thing I think for Americans to really come to understand Japan's system of government, I mean, I think it actually is a lot easier for Britons or Australians because you're coming from a system where you have a parliament. Parliamentary politics has a certain similarity anywhere. And the main idea being, and, just to put my political scientist hat on a little bit, I mean, the main idea being that you have the fusion of legislative and executive power. Generally the way it's supposed to work. And actually we can maybe bracket this and come back because things are a little weird now. But, generally the idea being that if you command a majority in the Diet, in Parliament in the UK or Parliament in Australia, that you can then form a government and the government can reliably pass legislation. Whereas, of course, in the United States, we have, divided government is certainly not uncommon. And, this idea of a separation of powers. And again, we're going to set aside the questions of whether the US system is working the way it's supposed to in the Constitution. Setting all that aside, at least the textbook way, I mean, it's just a different kind of system. It is not really founded on a separation of powers. It's really founded on the power of the prime minister's office. The cabinet really rests on majorities in the Diet, and everything flows from that. And so in theory, what should happen is that as long as the government can command majorities, that it can move its agenda. In practice, also, I should say, that sort of the unwritten constitution of Japan for much of the post-war period has been that fusion hasn't always worked, in part because you had very weak prime ministers, very weak cabinets, and actually a lot of power was concentrated elsewhere. So it actually ended up being much more diffuse than you would think, sort of a textbook parliamentary system where actually you had a lot of power in a few other places other than in the prime minister's office. And that would be within the long ruling Liberal Democratic Party itself, which had a lot of sort of veto power over what its own prime ministers actually were able to do. There was a lot of negotiation that would have to happen between, the prime minister might say, well, I want to do this. Well, okay, but you have all these power centers within the LDP that might have other opinions on that. So there'd be a lot of negotiation there. And Japan also has a very powerful bureaucracy, or historically has had a very powerful bureaucracy. And you can debate a lot about just how powerful that bureaucracy is. But one major difference between the United States and Japan, where you have a new president come in and to assert their control over the bureaucracy. And again, we can sort of bracket the current moment where there are things that are different than would have happened before. But generally speaking, presidents bring in a lot of political appointees. The top several layers down in every cabinet department are political appointees. Well, in Japan, the prime minister appoints a cabinet minister and appoints a vice minister and appoints, maybe a couple of what are called parliamentary secretaries. And that's kind of it. And so you have this sort of thin layer of political control over these bureaucracies that are, they're generally historically have attracted sort of the best and brightest from Japan's universities. These are elite people who know what they're doing, and they're generally outlasting any prime minister and any cabinet. So that generally is how it's worked. What really happened basically since the end of the Cold War was sort of a long-term process of changing how the system worked so that prime ministers actually did have a lot more power, a lot more capacity to set the agenda, to set the direction of the government, to assert control over the bureaucracy, to assert control over, when the prime ministers were from the LDP or had been from the LDP, to assert more control over the party. So the system, I mean, it worked one way, from the 50s basically into the 90s. Since the 90s, it has changed a bit. Much stronger executive, much stronger prime ministerial leadership than before.
Okay. That was actually my next question about the bureaucracy and like their level of involvement and just how that relationship kind of goes. So just maybe to expand on that a little bit, like bureaucracy is still present, obviously, in Japanese government, but like, is it still as central as it was previously now that there's a little bit more power in the prime minister?
It's not that the bureaucracy is, the bureaucracy is still very relevant. But
yeah,
what used to be the thing that people sort of wring their hands about as far as Japan's government was concerned was that bureaucrats would be committed to advancing their own ministry's interests. And so you'd have turf wars between ministries, fighting over, who was setting the agenda or who was more powerful and whose priorities would win out. And oftentimes what they would then do, they would basically have their allies in the LDP. And so you'd have kind of different parts of the LDP fighting against other parts of the LDP and sort of, kind of a tug of war between sort of different interests and different approaches. And so it's very hard to get sort of a unified approach to policymaking. What happens now, actually, is that in general, I think there's just more fusion kind of at the highest levels between bureaucrats and politicians. And so you do have, I think, more bureaucrats who basically have maybe a national view. And that's something that I think, reformers were sort of trying to encourage. They wanted bureaucrats to think less about, well, how do we advance the interests of our particular ministry and
right.
how do we think more nationally? And so you do have, I think, more bureaucrats who've sort of been pulled from their ministries to work in the prime minister's office. They have a lot of exposure to the prime minister, maybe relationships with politicians from very earlier in their career, and are sort of guided to have a more national view. I mean, there's still plenty of battles, between different ministries and different sort of who's up, who's down, sort of tug of war.
Tug of war,
It's
right?
still part of it, but there's definitely been a marked shift away from the kind of more parochial views of bureaucrats that you've had before. And I think I think very clearly now there's a sense that politicians are expected to really set the direction for the country. The bureaucrats are sort of waiting for clarity from political leaders on what policy should be and what the direction of the country should be.
Okay.
And you were talking about the LDP, which is the Liberal Democratic Party. Kind of remarkable that this one party has essentially held power for most of post-war period of Japan. Why has the LDP been able to stay dominant for so long, and what does that mean for Japan's political culture?
It is the question that every Japanese politics watcher has to face. I mean, some of it during the Cold War, it had as much to do with political system that was really divided along left-right grounds, with kind of a socialist party as the main opposition party that was actually very oriented towards communist China. You had an LDP that, had formed from kind of a mix of right-wing parties, and they could all sort of agree, well, we need to be aligned with the United States, we need to be part of the free world, and we need to be capitalist. And so therefore, whatever sort of disagreements they had amongst themselves, they sort of set those aside. And in the end, I mean, you just had, in general, just a public majority in favor of the politics the LDP represented. And of course, you had then within the LDP, again, lots of conflict, lots of different factions, different ideological tendencies that were sort of battling out for control of the LDP. But essentially, you had sometimes called like a 1.5 party system, where the LDP was so dominant, but was also never really able to get quite to a 2/3 majority that would have enabled it to revise the Constitution. So it was sort of kept in check, and the size of its majority sort of ebbed and flowed over those years. That's why sometimes it's not quite accurate to talk about sort of this uninterrupted period of dominance, because there are actually periods where, because of corruption scandals and kind of other issues, the LDP's majority actually would shrink quite a lot and was sort of holding on by a thread. And also there were stretches too where, in theory, you would think, well, okay, well, the LDP has these big majorities, so therefore it can do whatever it wants. But actually in practice, there were lots of consultations with the socialists. There were lots of work to ensure that sort of minority views were represented. So it was never quite absolute dominance. It was always much more cooperation and sort of consensus building, and the emphasis on the building. Sometimes I think people talk about, it's a consensus society. Well, no, I mean, consensus comes about through a process, and sometimes there's conflict as part of that. So it's not to say that, everyone just sort of knows how to conform. I mean, it wasn't that. I mean, there was a process, and a lot of it often happened sort of off stage. But, when we talk about LDP dominance, we should be careful, sort of unpack it a little bit.
Sure.
and realize that it was never quite absolute dominance, and it ebbed and flowed throughout the Cold War. What's really happened since the early 90s, though, I mean, the LDP has continued to be Japan's ruling party, but the circumstances of that have been very different over the last 30 years. So in some ways, it's not necessarily useful to say, well, the LDP, and in fact, the LDP is a few weeks away from celebrating its 70th birthday, but we can't say that those 70 years have been uniform or that everything has been the same. And so, in the 90s, they were driven from power in 1993 by the sort of rambunctious coalition of parties. They came back in 1994, but as a party in coalition with their longtime adversary, the socialists. And then, basically up until literally this month, have governed always with at least one coalition partner. So never solely dominant, really requiring other partners to govern. We also saw during basically the period from, say, 1999 or so up until 2012 that you basically had a two-party system, or at least sort of a nascent two-party system that ultimately culminated in the LDP really, for the first time in its history, losing an election outright. I mean, and really almost, the number of seats they won, I mean, it was shocking how poorly they performed. And you got the Democratic Party of Japan coming into power from 2009 to 2012. And then, so that you had that sort of 12-year period of basically something resembling a two-party democracy. And then since 2012, there was a stretch where people were calling it sort of the one strong, many weak party system, where the LDP was, had this stretch of dominance when the late Abe Shinzo was back in power, and the LDP won 6 national elections in a row and had large majorities. And then, over the last several years, we've moved to a much more chaotic situation where the LDP actually is much less dominant. Things are much more fragmented, but you don't really have this sort of two-party system that we saw during the first decade. And so, again, it's like if from the outside, it looks like, okay, well, it's a system that has been characterized by LDP dominance, and that's the story. But actually, when you start looking at it, you realize there have been phases. You do have change. You do have things that are changing the structure of political power. And so it's important not to overlook that and not to just sort of like look at the, okay, well, the LDP is in power. And so therefore that's all that matters. And there's not change. I mean, actually, no, there's real change happening. And it's important to look at that and to take that into consideration.
Yeah, you can't just like look at the surface.
And I think that's what a lot of people do. They see just LDP at the top, the prime minister's LDP, and just assume everything's like, standard across the board. Yeah.
And I had kind of a mini question. How many parties are there?
I'm
sorry if that's a stupid question. I know nothing about Japanese politics.
Let's think if I can name them all now, because you've had periods of pretty intense party formation and dissolution and combination. I mean, the 90s were really the peak of that. I mean, but this period the last decade we saw some, we see some now. So of course you have the LDP. The LDP now, as of several weeks ago, is now governing in partnership with a party that is really Osaka-based, that's been around since around 2009, 2010, called, in Japanese, it's Ishin no Kai, the Ishin as in the Meiji Ishin, and sometimes translated as the Japan Restoration Party, sometimes translated as the Japan Innovation Party. Usually I just, like in my own writing, I'll just call it Ishin no Kai because I think the translation, none of the translations, I don't know, they don't really tell you that much. So they are now the junior partner in government, although they're not actually in government, but they are supporting the LDP with their seats in the Diet. The leading opposition party now, just even in terms of number of seats, is the Constitutional Democratic Party, in Japanese, Rikken Minshito. They are sort of the main successor party to the Democratic Party of Japan, which was in power in 2009, 2012. And in fact, its leader right now, Noda Yoshihiko, was the last DPJ prime minister. Noda himself calls himself a moderate conservative. There are definitely parts of the party that are very progressive, and their election manifestos, not this past election last year, but 2 elections ago, actually was probably one of the most progressive platforms that a Japanese party has ever run on, particularly on social issues. I mean, they ran on a platform that was very much, pro same-sex marriage. They've been very enthusiastic proponents of gender equality. So there are progressive elements to it, but not uniformly so. So really anywhere from sort of center right to center left. Mm-hmm. So that's the CDP. Then you have another DPJ offshoot called the Democratic Party for the People, in Japanese Kokumi Minshito. The CDP and DPP or DPFP, they're both backed by organized labor, but Kokumi Minshito is a little more conservative in its views. They are more in favor of stronger national defense. They're pro-nuclear energy, which the CDP has been more ambivalent about. So there are some differences there. The thing to know about Kokumi Minshito now is they're trying to do this thing where, okay, so traditionally they've had this backing from organized labor, but they are trying to pivot to becoming a party that is more the party of young urban workers who actually tend to generally not be unionized. And so they have sort of a populist element they've really called for and really gained a lot of support, calling for tax changes that would make life easier for sort of younger urban workers, maybe trying to start families or working part-time. Yeah, so they have a pretty enthusiastic following from the young now. They're also pretty adept at social media. So that's Kokumi Minshito. Also on the right wing, the other party that perhaps your listeners have heard of because they got a lot of attention in the upper house election over the summer, this newer party called Sanseito, which unlike a lot of parties has started really as more of a bottom-up kind of organization. They began sort of during the pandemic as kind of an anti-vax, anti-globalist kind of slightly conspiratorial party that almost started from online organizing and then kind of anti-vax, anti-masking protests, and has admittedly an impressive organizational network. I mean, they've really have become an organization that relies on dues-paying members and then sort of delivering services to its dues-paying members, really training up volunteers and activists kind of across the country. And their rise has been, in some ways, very sudden. I mean, I think the party officially formed in 2022, has fielded candidates in the last couple elections, but then really in the upper house elections earlier this year, it was really the first time that they really made their presence known in the political system. Had lots of candidates. They won 15 seats in the upper house. In fact, I think they got more votes nationally than the CDP in the upper house election. So, just came somewhat out of nowhere. Even if you look at like press coverage, there really wasn't much press coverage even of Sanseto until say like June of this year. And the other thing to note about them is that they have really positioned themselves as an anti-immigrant party. Their leader, Kamiya Sohei, has likened his party to the AfD in Germany, or kind of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. It's really kind of positioning himself as part of this populist right wave. And so their agitation and activism have really put kind of this question of Japan's foreign population, which is now, still relatively small compared to other countries, but bigger than it's really ever been. They've put that on the political agenda. So it was something that other parties had to address during the upper house campaign. It was something that when the LDP had its leadership election recently, every candidate had to have some position on. It is something that the new Prime Minister, Takaichi Sanai, she has now really made as part of her governing agenda. So in that sense, it's a small party, it's a young party, but it has had maybe an outsized impact on the system, really seeing that there were issues that were not being addressed, and it created an opportunity for it to make itself known and make itself sort of as part of the system. You do have, of course, parties on the left as well, some smaller parties on the left. Japan still has a communist party, the Japanese Communist Party. It is 100 years old. It has an aging electoral base. It is in a lot of ways, you could say the Japanese Communist Party is a small c conservative party, because ultimately they are very resistant to, they want to defend the Constitution from revision, attempts by conservatives to revise it. Generally speaking, they want to preserve some of the more egalitarian features of the post-war Japanese economy. They are, resisting kind of neoliberal reform. So they're very much a kind of a change-resistant party, which is a really funny thing to say about a communist party. But but that's kind of the reality of what they are now. You also have sort of a new populist left party called Reiwa Shinsengumi, which in some ways is crowding out the Communist Party because their positions are very similar on a lot of issues, but they're appealing to sort of younger people on the left. So you do have a certain amount of splintering on the left between those parties. You do still have the remnant of the now called the Social Democratic Party, but what had been the lead opposition party throughout the Cold War, the Japanese Socialist Party, which I think still has maybe one or two Diet members, but is basically...
It's like falling apart.
Nothing like what it was for many decades. And you also have on the right the Conservative Party of Japan, which is led by novelist Hyakuta Naoki, who's wrote A no Zero about kamikaze pilots. That's sort of like the main political forces at this point.
Wow.
I left out Komeito, of course. How can I? So, which, till recently, an extremely, extremely important. So Komeito is the kind of sister organization to the lay Buddhist organization Soka Gakkai, and has been a party since the late 1950s, and was an opposition party for a long time, and then in the late 90s actually joined a coalition with the LDP and really was an important adjunct to the LDP for a lot of those years, and has a nationwide network of volunteers and supporters, and was able to really mobilize a lot of voters to help LDP candidates get elected. That coalition held together for 25 years through a lot of challenges. And then at the start of October, after Takaichi became LDP leader, and the LDP and Komeito had negotiations to try to renew their coalition partnership, and they were not able to do that. And so for the first time in 25 years now, or 26 years, Komeito is now an opposition party again. And so this is, a pretty significant change in a lot of different ways. Not only has changed how the LDP can control the Diet, but also means that Komeito and its several million voters are now essentially up for grabs. And, which way they end up going, there's already signs that they might work with the CDP, where there actually is quite a lot of overlap on a number of issues. It has the potential to really impact the political landscape. So that really bad. I really should have brought Komeito up a lot sooner, but anyway, yes. So, and Komeito, the thing about Komeito too is like they are almost like in the dead center of the political spectrum. So of course, they are nominally pacifist, but they've maybe shifted more in favor of Japan doing a little more to defend itself, over the course of its coalition with the LDP, and sort of sort of recognizing that as the world changes, Japan has to change. Generally speaking, they have been a voice for really improving the quality of life, particularly for people in big cities. It's sort of, you might say, it's kind of economic base has been kind of the urban, petite bourgeoisie, like, kind of shopkeepers and families. I mean, it has a very strong women's division that really has advanced kind of gender issues and rights for women in the workforce and things like that. So, really a semi-progressive force. And maybe if it does end up cooperating with the CDP, actually ends up looking, for a long time, it kind of considered itself as a break on the LDP. The LDP kind of wanting to be more right wing, and Komoto would basically pull them a little more back towards the center, don't go too far that way. The question is, do they then kind of pull the CDP more towards the center, or does the CDP kind of bring out some of the more progressive tendencies in Komoto? I mean, this is kind of one of the questions I think that is pending. And also, the last thing about Komoto too is they also are dealing with an aging electorate, and sort of they're dealing with the impact of social change as well. So there's a lot of change happening in the party system. is the bottom line.
Before we move on to the question about voting and voters, but I did have one kind of follow up. For all these parties, like you said, Sanseito rose from out of nowhere over the last 5 years. How do they rise to power to some extent? Is it through like local elections first, or do they have like one charismatic person that they put up for a seat in the Diet?
They haven't necessarily had breakthroughs in local government elections, and they're really ramping up those efforts as well. And in fact, they just fell short this past Sunday they had a candidate they were backing in a gubernatorial election in Miyagi Prefecture and fell just short of winning that governorship. But it's more that they really built out their activist base. And, having, the volunteers, having sort of the infrastructure in place, having the local organizations everywhere, that then gave them sort of a pool of people to start recruiting candidates from. And when those candidates were running, that they would then have the volunteers to go out and do the work. The thing to understand about Japanese politics is that, just from my perspective as an American citizen and voter, there's much more of an emphasis on face-to-face contact with voters. That unlike in the United States, where it feels like so much is online, so much is TV ads, so much is, this kind of indirect appeals to voters. A lot of Japanese politics happens on the ground. A lot of it is meeting voters outside of train stations and distributing flyers and putting up posters. And and Sanseito is both a sign of this and also a driver of this. There's a lot of political activity moving online. There's much more happening on social media and using YouTube and using X. All of that is very much a part of Japanese politics now. But in some ways, there's almost a synergy between, you have a rally outside of a train station, and then you post the video and the video goes viral. And there's still a lot that happens on the ground, which means that you have to have the volunteers. You have to have, people who are kind of handing out the flyers and setting up the events and setting up the events. And so all of that is still, I think, very much a part of Japanese political activity. And so what Sanseito, I think, has done is really having that organization of volunteers to draw from in place. And then now it's, actually starting to elect people to the Diet. So now it's, and the thing, once you start electing people, certainly what I saw in my experience where I worked for a DPJ Diet member now almost 20 years ago. And what ended up happening is that once you have elected officials, those elected officials can then work on behalf of your other candidates and help them get elected. And so,
Right.
Like I was working for an upper house member, and when he would do events, like he was doing events for another, for DPJ candidate for the upper house, and he basically would organize DPJ local assembly members or prefectural assembly members, and they would sort of all do events together. And, so the prefectural assembly member has their list and their followers, and bring them out, tell your people we're doing an event for this candidate here, and so you start having this sort of network that can really strengthen those connections and really sort of build out an organization. And so what's happened is, with Sanseito, I think, is that you've gotten sort of the organization first, and now you're getting the candidates. Now you're starting to elect people to office, and, they're trying to, I think, get the snowball effect that way. What happened with the DPJ and a lot of other parties actually, though, is that, a lot of them began sort of as people who were maybe originally LDP lawmakers who left, and you sort of start these parties almost, as top-down organizations where you have someone maybe who's already been elected to office, and then they break away and they start a party, and then you're going the other direction where, okay, we have people who are in office nationally, now we have to build a party around that.
Yeah.
And which, it's a very different way of organizing, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems very like not black and white.
Yeah.
That was a very detailed explanation, and it just shows like just how many views there are, and it's kind of like, how do you pick, honestly?
That kind of brings me to my next question too, is like just like
Yeah.
voter turnout and political engagement. You mentioned how politicians go and they go literally face to face and meet with their voters, their constituents. And I forget the term for it. Stumping? Is that the right term?
Yeah,
Like where they go and like
yeah,
stand outside of a station and kind of just talk.
Yeah, you do your stump speech. Yeah.
Yeah. But like in general, like obviously as a foreigner living in America right now, but I lived in Japan for a few years, and political engagement and turnout wasn't as visual as it is in the US. Like you mentioned earlier, like it's much more like in your face, especially during football season. It's like ads in between every snap almost, But so how politically active is your average Japanese voter? What shapes, people's attitudes toward politics? Like here, it's like party line voting. If you have an R behind your name, you vote for whoever is there. If you have a D, you vote for the D. It depends. And that's not always the case. There's issues too that people kind of stand behind, vote along those lines. But is it similar in Japan?
No. It's a political system that's been much less polarized, and certainly post Cold War, there's been less. There's certainly less left-right polarization. And some of that is the LDP has been very good at co-opting issues. And, it's like you don't have, the LDP as an identity where it's, this is the free market party, and then, you have the socialists on the other side. Like that was, during the Cold War, you had much more polarization, right? You knew with the LDP, you were getting the party that, pro-alliance with the United States and resisting socialization of the economy. And, but also the LDP was very open to a strong role for the state. And so it's very much like trying to find a middle. The LDP has generally been very good at trying to be sort of a party that can find the middle and can capture sort of a majority of voters, and also has historically just had a very strong electoral machine. And every LDP member has their sort of local organization that's generally been very strong. And so the LDP also, a lot of close relationships with business interests. And so being able to get support from, this business association or that business, very clearly knowing the economic interest the LDP is representing, of course, very close to the agricultural sector, and historically rural Japan has been relatively overrepresented in the Diet. And that's been corrected somewhat, but still the case. You can look at sort of the economic interest the LDP represents, and that explains a lot of what you've seen. Over time, the LDP has become maybe, there's certainly been efforts. And of course, Abe was a big proponent of this, making the LDP a much more sort of uniformly conservative party, much more of an ideological instrument, and certainly did try to achieve that. But the work was not entirely complete. And in fact, what you're seeing now is an effort by the LDP's new leader, Takaichi, to try to make the LDP into sort of a more ideological instrument again to sort of complete the work that Abe didn't finish. But the LDP, of course, just because it has been such a big party and it's Big Ten, it has really been capable of occupying sort of that center-right space for a long period of time. And as a result, a lot of, for example, so post-Cold War, the DPJ, even when you had sort of this nascent two-party system, the DPJ never had quite as deep an electoral machine. It wasn't ever quite able to mobilize as many voters as DPJ voters in the way that like LDP voters are LDP voters, and LDP supporters, LDP dues-paying members. The DPJ's rise depended much more on independence. We have floating voters who were sort of unattached, and they were willing to give the DPJ a chance. That's what really happened. Most parties generally have not had, really dedicated electoral machines. The communists do, but it's shrinking. Komeito has had a very strong electoral machine, but it's shrinking. You've kind of had these sort of right-wing parties start up. They have less dedicated electoral machines, people who are sort of part of the party machinery who can be relied upon to turn out. The LDP generally has been the party that has been most capable of turning out its voters, and actually often. And certainly this is what helped Abe win 6 national elections in a row when he returned to the premiership in 2012, which was turnout fell. And so the LDP and Komeito would be able to reliably turn out their machines, but the opposition parties really had a hard time getting independents to turn out. And so you had a real fall in turnout. And basically, if the independents stay home and the LDP machine shows up, then, the LDP is going to win elections pretty reliably. But you do have change now. And I think what you really have begun to see, and certainly became clear in the last couple elections, is you're seeing more age polarization where the LDP is feeling very disconnected from younger voters, from urban voters, from voters under 40. And they have turned to Sanseto in big ways. They have turned to the Democratic Party for the People in big ways. And, a lot of it's just economic issues where it just feels like the older, more established parties are listening to older voters. They're listening to rural voters. And so they're not really speaking to the needs and the concerns of younger voters. And so one of the things that now Prime Minister Takaichi is trying to do is bring some of these voters back to the LDP. Because interestingly, one of the things that did happen in the upper house election in July of this year is that turnout actually was the highest it had been in an upper house election in quite a long time. And a lot of that, I think, was, Sanseto turning out younger voters, the Democratic Party for People turning out younger voters. And it was not a good election for the LDP. So, this is a real challenge because if these voters start consistently turning out, you're going to have more kind of floating voters out there. And which way they go, I mean, you might have a real kind of tug of war over these voters, and a real race to try to bring these voters around. And so, this is really this is where Japanese politics is now. Because you have this age polarization, how is that going to change the behavior of parties as they deal with this new reality?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the prime minister's position, and one thing that stands out is how often Japan changes prime ministers. And it seems like there's a new one almost every year. Yet it seems like policies and overall direction often remain pretty steady. How does the leadership style and influence of a prime minister actually matter in Japan compared to like the strength of the institutions and the party system?
First, I mean, I do want to push back a little bit against this idea of there have been periods where you've had revolving door. You have kind of a prime minister, and I think, in some ways there was this, this period from 2006 to 2012 where you did get a prime minister every year that I think has really implanted this idea of Japan as, really having a revolving door. But you've also, you have had periods where you've had more durable premierships. You did have, Abe was in power for almost 8 years.
Yeah, and isn't that the longest running?
And he had the longest tenure. And then, you had Suga finishing his term, but then you had Kishida around for 3 years. Ishiba 1 year. We'll see how long Takaichi lasts. The fact is, this is sometimes, in America, because we have presidents with set terms, we assume you have a leader, they should be around for that long. But actually, one of the virtues, I think, of parliamentary systems actually is that they do have mechanisms for changing leaders that are relatively more efficient than in a presidential system, where if a leader fails, you're stuck, right? Like you can't, if something goes wrong, essentially, as we've seen, essentially America doesn't really have a system for replacing its leaders. The bar to impeachment is so high that it is very hard to replace a leader. Whereas you see, prime ministers change in Australia all the time. Prime ministers change in Japan, because a leader, has failed or the public has abandoned them. And instead of having to just sort of be stuck with a leader who has essentially lost the confidence of the public, you have mechanisms for change. And frankly, that doesn't seem like necessarily a bad thing. Governments get old, they get stale. They make mistakes. They are overwhelmed by events. They are overwhelmed by scandal. And it doesn't seem like such a bad thing that it's possible to change. Too much change can be bad. And I think one thing that has happened when you have had periods of very short-lived governments in Japan is that, essentially because you've had a shift to a more top-down system, the system does require a prime minister setting an agenda and setting the direction and providing a certain amount of clarity and consistency. And if you don't have that, then you just sort of get the bureaucracy governing on autopilot. And that's not great either. You're not going to really get creative responses to anything. You just sort of keep doing the same thing, over and over again. And one of the things that you did end up getting when you had, Abe governing from late 2012 until August of 2020 is the government could say, we're going to do this, and then actually kind of see things through and follow up. And also experiment.
Yeah.
The thing that actually really characterized the Abe years was, to borrow a phrase that FDR used for his government, speaking of sort of extra long tenured leaders, is bold, persistent experimentation. Abe was just like trying different things to get Japan's economy growing. And, having a leader around for that long and having that kind of mandate and having that ability to govern actually enabled that kind of experimentation. So there's certainly virtues to having leaders who are not around for just a year. And, having that kind of turnover isn't great. And to rewind back to your question about sort of continuity, there is a certain amount of things that the LDP has, consistently committed to doing. And I think, it's particularly strong on foreign policy where the party has, I think now outlined an approach that it's going to take regardless of who's in office. We're going to hew as close to the United States as we can. We're going to try to strengthen relationships with other democracies in the Asia Pacific. We're going to try to get closer to Europe. We're going to now try to strengthen relations with South Korea. I mean, there's a certain amount of consensus around these ideas that is pushing forward. There's probably less consensus on economic policy. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole on discussing that. I mean, there are real divisions within the LDP and also across party lines on that. But there's certain areas where I think there's just a degree of consensus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I it's funny because I kind of when I was putting this question together, I was thinking back to my time on JET, which I was there from 2007 to 2010. And that was during that time of constant flux. I think it was literally on almost a Google Calendar notification. Hey, time to change your prime minister. It was like 365 days every year. And ironically, Shinzo Abe was prime minister when I started JET. And do you think that 1 year period where he was prime minister taught him something that allowed him to adapt his policy and how he governed, his second term that allowed him to stick around for 8 years?
Yeah. I mean, I read about this in my book behind me.
I know, I saw your book.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason I wanted to write about it was that I was very early in my career watching Japanese politics when he was prime minister for the first time and sort of watched his government collapse. And, even just as like a personal defeat, or a personal moment, I mean, that it's hard to fail and fail as publicly as he did. And it was really the first time in his life that he had ever kind of known failure like that. And so just as a human story, to recover from that, to throw yourself back into the political arena and to find a way back into power, I mean, as a human story, I think there's just something very compelling about that. But actually, after he resigned, he actually started filling notebooks with thoughts about what went wrong, what should I do differently, what can I learn from that experience? How do I get another chance? And if I get that chance, how do I make it a success? Which, again, as a human story is really kind of remarkable. The ability to learn from failure like that and to recover from failure like that. Just a really compelling story to tell.
Okay. Well, we'll get back to that later on because I know we're going to let you talk about your book a little bit later on. But before we get too far down that road, I did want to ask a question since we did mention the global policy and just Japan's kind of emergence from its isolationist period back in the mid 1800s. It opens itself up to the world. And as a result, Japan and politics in general can't completely exist in a bubble. They have relationships in East Asia, specifically China and Korea and Taiwan and obviously the US. All of this feeds back into the domestic politics as well, though. So how do those international dynamics come into play and influence how Japan acts politically inside the country?
I love this question, actually. Because it really speaks to kind of how I think about my work. And it goes both directions because I think, sometimes people kind of looking at Japan from the outside, are most interested in, well, what is Japan's foreign policy? What is it doing with the world? But, you just can't understand the kind of opportunities and constraints that Japanese leaders have in the world without understanding it's democracy, and the political strength they have at home makes possible what they're able to do abroad. And so just adamant that if you don't know the constraints that a Japanese government faces or the kind of bases for its power, it's very hard to know and to really appreciate what its political possibilities are in the US-Japan alliance or in relations with its neighbors. I mean, but that's any democracy. You cannot isolate a government. And really, in practice, every country has domestic politics. China has domestic politics. Every leader has domestic constituencies, domestic constraints, domestic interests that it has to manage and balance and listen to. And if you don't have that, you just can't fully appreciate the choices that government is making in the world. And so I think that just is the starting point of pretty much everything I do when it comes to thinking about Japanese politics. Remember that Japan has domestic politics too. As far as how the world is shaping Japan's politics, we've talked, this conversation about the ways in which the Cold War shaped the choices that Japan's voters faced, that because, the question of Japan's relations with the world were such a fundamental divide in the country's domestic politics. I mean, it absolutely shaped the party system and how things were organized. I mean, in fact, this is a current book project is really thinking about how that party system emerged in the 1950s based on sort of the deepening Cold War and the impact that had on Japan's politics. Now it's different because you don't have the organizing structure of the Cold War, the world divided into two camps. You don't have this sort of parallel in the domestic politics necessarily. You do have, though, some debate over, how much should Japan spend on its defense? What sort of defense capabilities should Japan have? What should the priority be when it comes to, prioritizing relations with the United States versus being part of Asia and prioritizing good relations with Japan's neighbors? What does getting along with China mean? There are some different, some parties might give different answers to that question. I do think ultimately, what we are seeing now, though, is maybe a consensus, and certainly post 2022. I think it's very hard for any party to resist the reality that Japan actually faces a much more dangerous world. Another book project I've kicked around that sort of Japan is, sort of the politics of, Japan as a frontline state. This is how they've thought of themselves kind of post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that we are now here sitting and just, in our neighborhood, we have 3 nuclear armed authoritarian states, facing off against us that are increasingly, working with each other. How is that filtering into Japan's politics? It is in ways that I think have created a certain amount of urgency when it comes to, needing to have political stability, and sort of if Japan's government is not stable, that you're not going to be able to properly meet these challenges. But in terms of, it hasn't quite shaped the choices. If anything, it's probably pushed the CDP more to the right, because it has had to, I think, moderate some of its positions, where 10 years ago, a lot of the members of the CDP were against some of Abe's reforms to enable Japan to engage in collective self-defense. There's been a real push to kind of moderate that opposition, to be more tolerant of higher defense spending. And so that's probably one thing that we're seeing in domestic political competition as a result of the world around Japan changing.
Okay.
Earlier, you were talking about how they get in touch with the voters and how it's more in person, but the media landscape in Japan that is present, what exactly does that look like? How do they cover politics, and how much of it does it shape public perception and accountability?
They have a very vibrant political media landscape. There's, a lot of attention to political developments. I think there's a lot of negative discussion of the Japanese press, that they're not adversarial. They are just, because of how they cover politicians, that, that it just ends up being very cozy and there's not, really any critical attention. I think some of that can be overstated. And the thing that I think is worth understanding is just how well informed Japanese reporters are. And they know a lot. And some of it is just the nature of how they cover. And some of it maybe doesn't bleed into coverage necessarily, although you kind of have to learn how to read between the lines sometimes, and learning how to read the subtext of, a Japanese political article is, was sort of a big part of my work. And also, knowing how some information will kind of filter to the tabloids first and then become something that the mainstream news organizations pick up. The thing to understand, though, and this goes back to what I was saying about age polarization.
Mm-hmm.
There is, and in some ways this is Japan converging maybe with other democracies, where Japan's daily newspapers have had large circulations for much longer than, for example, in the United States, where, of course, newspaper readership has collapsed and, newspapers are laying off workers and, you have a real crisis. Japan has somewhat delayed that crisis. But what you do have now actually is a tremendous amount of polarization in the news sources that people use. And so over 40, people read newspapers, people watch broadcast TV. It's sort of very traditional news sources and sort of the way it's always been. Under 40, young Japanese are not reading newspapers. They're not watching normal sort of broadcast television. It's social media, it's YouTube. It is very much not the traditional news sources. And so there is that sort of information polarization feeding political polarization. So, you have these sort of anti-establishment conservative parties that are much more adept at being online, that have sort of benefited from disinformation or misinformation that has spread, that maybe they have encouraged. You've seen a lot of misinformation about Japan's foreign population that has spread, that has been maybe fueled by Sanseito supporters. And and has perhaps contributed to its rise. But young people, that is where they are predominantly getting their news. And so you do have this situation where do older voters and younger voters even exist in the same reality, the same social reality, because they're getting
Right.
information from such different sources? Is a real question. It's really something that Japan is grappling with. And there's lots of talk about, do you need, regulations of social media? Do you need after this election in Miyagi this past weekend, the victorious candidate was this LDP backed candidate who during the campaign was dealing with all sorts of misinformation about him and positions he was taking and things he believed. And like the first thing he said after being elected was, I want to push for some sort of third party fact checking to resist this. But does fact checking actually matter if the people consuming the fact checks already aren't the people, but this is it really speaks to an issue that is only growing in importance when it comes to kind of how Japanese politics works now.
But I feel like too, especially in the United States, we have 24-hour news cycles that have constantly breaking news broadcasts on like the little ticker at the bottom, just constantly being fed information about something or, a topic. If it's not related to politics right at that moment, it probably will be within the next 5 minutes. So it's kind of like constantly in your face. Whereas I think maybe at least in the traditional media outlets, you're not being bombarded nonstop with these like news cycles of just your politicians and political issues and things like that.
I mean, I think what there's more substance, like where you realize like so much is just what makes for like the 24-hour or even less. I mean, we're it's been years since we had a 24-hour news cycle. Now we have like a 6-hour news cycle or something like that. But, there's a tendency to, viral moments that are kind of posturing and, that there's not a whole lot of actual substance. I mean, what you do get in the traditional Japanese media is I think a lot of an actual engagement in the substance of policy. And this party says this party says that, this is the differences, this is what they're saying, this is what they're promising to do. This is, like when you had sort of the LDP and Komeito, trying to renew their coalition. I mean, you had some pretty detailed coverage of that. And like, here's why it's important. Here's why this is happening. Here's why they might not come to an agreement. Here's sort of where, the sort of the sticking points in the negotiation. And then when the talks broke down, like, oh, here are the implications of this. Here's a really important thing. And we'll tell you why. And I feel like as someone who basically every day reads like 6 or 7 different Japanese news sources, and I mean, I probably need to be better about just watching TV just to kind of see what that conversation is like. But the point is, you can actually come away very informed on the political stakes, the policy stakes, like, really know what's happening, right. And most Japanese probably are not reading quite as extensively as I am because I have to. But no, I mean, you can really, I think, come away with, some pretty granular understanding of what the stakes are in a way that I feel like sometimes political coverage in the United States does end up being very shallow and horse racy and who's up, who's down.
Just a little bit. Before we get to our closing remarks, I did have one question about just where things are headed. Like you mentioned, aging population. We have immigration issues in terms of not just immigration in general, but also labor and just how things are changing around the world. Do you think there are some big changes on the horizon for Japan in terms of how they're governing their country as you've observed Japan?
Yeah, and Japan has been really in a period of change and fluidity and fragmentation for several years now, and I suspect that's likely to continue for some time to come, where you do have these sort of competing demands from different age groups for public resources. You have some real fiscal constraints on what the government is able to spend money on and really competing demands. I mean, I think one of the biggest questions Takaichi faces, you want to raise defense spending. Well, where's the money going to come from? Mm-hmm. You have a world order that is changing, the sort of things Japan has taken for granted, it cannot take for granted. And so that's going to maybe impose some new demands on what the Japanese government does to ensure the country's security. You do have, the challenges of a growing foreign population. And the reality is that I think, there ultimately is not really a consensus on taking in fewer foreign workers, but it does mean, that trying to figure out how to accommodate a more diverse population of residents in Japan than you've ever had, is really going to be an ongoing challenge and really an ongoing issue that the government's going to be grappling with. The labor shortages are real. The shrinking workforce is real. all of this is there. The fact that the kind of depopulation of the countryside is continuing, and that's going to impose some real cost, when it comes to maintaining the level of public services that people have become accustomed to. It's all of that is challenge. It is going to be a difficult era, and I think that also has resulted in weaker governments that aren't really able to command the majorities that they have, because you just have so many different forces pulling in different directions. And so this is the reality, I think, of Japan, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, with the fragmentation, especially with those issues, is it going to become more like issue based? Is that how it's going to trend, do you think?
I mean, I think you're going to have, there is, I think, a potential really for floating voters for independence, really being more engaged and playing more of a factor in sort of swinging between different parties to help governments form. I think that is the reality now. It's hard to say, how durable a force does Sanseto end up being. It really does feel like you have a system that kind of is divided along three lines, where you have sort of like a sort of moderate conservative center that is part of the LDP and part of the CDP, and probably, you could put Komeito maybe in that, bucket as well. And then you have sort of the anti-establishment conservatives, who part of the LDP, and Sanseto, and the Democratic Party for the People to some extent, and then kind of the smaller progressive part of the system, but is still present, is still there. So you do have these sort of three groups, and it doesn't seem that any single one is able to command a majority. And so kind of how you get consensus from that, is sort of the challenge now. Is there a majority that can sort of be cobbled together from two of those blocks?
Interesting. Well, we'll have to see. We got to observe Japan, and we'll be observing Japan through the lens of Japan Foresight. And your work, you do a great job of that. So I wanted to give you an opportunity as we wrap up to let people know where they could find your research, your documentation, your book, your website, whatever else you would like to share.
So the book was published in 2020 and updated 2023, is The Iconoclast Shinzo Abe in the New Japan, which is a biography of Abe, but also really the story of his family history. So really going back to much earlier in the 20th century and his role as a dynastic politician, but then also the story of Japanese politics basically since the early 1990s and what's changed. So that book is available, I guess, as the ad copy goes, wherever fine books are sold. And then Substack is Observing Japan. I, as of a month or so ago, have started writing basically a daily briefing on kind of the biggest political stories every day, and usually try to include lots and lots of links to the original Japanese sources, because I think there is a lot of material out there, and it's worth calling that to the attention of readers so they know where to find it in the original Japanese, because there is, I think, still a gap between how the kind of granular detail you get in English versus the Japanese language. So try to flag that. And also if you have listeners who are Japanese language learners, lots and lots of links to Japanese sources and things to read. So, I'm basically committed to doing that every day, ideally, and at least once over the weekend. And there's other writing there as events strike me, and essays and things like that. And then for more business oriented listeners, I do have a business that covers kind of politics and policy with much more granularity, much more event driven and kind of forward looking. So that is Japan Foresight. You can find me those places, and reach out if you have any questions.
Awesome. And social media, I know you're on Blue Sky. I know, where else are you currently on?
That's mainly where I am now.
Okay. That's where I see you mostly. So
yeah.
Okay. Well, what we'll do is we'll link out to your website, your Substack, your Blue Sky, and happy to share that out there. Because I do think that the work you're doing on your Substack especially is really great for those who are interested, because it does give you a little snapshot of what's going on every day, how things are changing and progressing literally every day. So keep up the great work. I really enjoy following you, and it's always fun reading your posts and your tweets. Oh, tweets, skeets, whatever they call them.
Yeah, whatever. Just posts.
But yeah, thank you again so much. I'm glad we could work something out and get you on before your trip. And I'm going to try to get this out relatively quick.
Okay.
I don't know how quick, if it's this week or next week, but might put some oil in the old lantern and work some into the wee hours of the night to get this out. But we're going to try to get this out quick, because I think that a lot of the topics discussed today were pretty relevant to today and the foreseeable coming weeks.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, I mean, this is, I don't think I said anything that will be overcome by events if it takes a little time to get this out, but it's a pretty fluid moment. So
Yeah.
people who maybe think Japanese politics never changes, I don't have to really pay attention because in the end the LDP is still going to be in power. There's a lot happening not that far below the surface, so it's worth looking. Pretty much anyone from any democracy should be watching Japan because it's a lot of the same forces that are kind of pulling things along. Plus, because they're so much further along the demographic change timeline that every other country is following, there's a lot to learn from Japan's experience with some of these issues.
It could be a model for the future for a lot of other countries. So
there's some political scientists who've called Japan the harbinger state. That it's further along in so many ways. So there's a lot to learn from Japan and its politics and how it changes in response to some of these social forces.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your information with us. We really appreciate it. Our listeners are really going to appreciate this as well.
Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap on today's crash course into Japanese politics with our sensei, Tobias Harris. We hope this episode helped make Japan's political landscape feel a little clearer, or maybe even spark some interest and curiosity to keep on learning. Japanese politics is always evolving, as we found out in this episode, and especially in recent news with all those new parties and leaders. And as we also had mentioned towards the end of the episode, these fluid changes and ongoing domestic challenges that Japan is facing can only continue to shift the landscape faster than anyone can expect. A huge thank you to Tobias Harris again for breaking down everything in such an accessible way and for helping us understand not only the headlines, but the deeper structures shaping Japan today. If you're interested in learning more about Japan and its political scene, definitely check out Tobias's book, The Iconoclast, or give his Substack, Observing Japan, a follow. We'll have all that and more linked out in our show notes. And as always, thank you so much for tuning into Krewe of Japan Podcast. We do this for you guys, so if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or on social media. We'll get to those in a second. But if you have an extra minute to spare in your day while you're listening to this, feel free to hop into whatever app you're on and leave us a 5-star rating and or review. Or maybe share this episode with a friend who loves talking politics. We all got one of those. But every single one of those 5-star ratings and reviews helps others discover Krewe of Japan and join our global crew. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. Don't forget to check us out on our socials: Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, X. Just search Krewe of Japan Podcast to stay in the loop with our future episodes, upcoming Japan Society events, and other Japan-related content. That's KREWEOFJAPAN, Krewe of Japan. Or maybe you want to reach out to us directly and privately. Send us an email at kreweofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. We'd really love to hear from you. But that's it for today. Until next time. Looking to start your own podcast and don't know what platform to use? Tell me about it. When we started the Krewe of Japan podcast, we tried a bunch of the big name recording platforms, but always came back to the one we're still currently using to this day, Zencastr. Zencastr is now the all-in-one solution making podcasting easy. In addition to its high audio and video quality for podcast production, Zencastr provides a full suite of production tools to record, produce, and publish studio quality content from the comfort of your home. Just log in through your browser and start recording. It's that simple. For us, we simply send out links to our guests and they join the lobby. But before you know it, it's all done and you have your studio quality audio and up to 4K video right there ready for you, right when you finish. The best part is having their multi-layered backups to ensure that your recordings are in the highest quality, regardless of anyone's internet connection stability. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcasts in one place and distribute to all the major destinations. It's really that easy. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our code Krewe of Japan, KREWEOFJAPAN, and you'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencastr paid plan. We want you to have the same easy experiences we do for all of our podcasting and content needs. It's your time to share your story.